Hello and welcome to another episode of Recovery Stories Have Power. My name is Oliver Books. On today's episode, I had the privilege of chatting with the former United States Surgeon General, Dr. Jerome Adams. Dr. Adams is a presidential fellow and the executive director of Purdue's Health Equity Initiatives as of October 1st, 2021. He is also a distinguished professor of practice in the Department of Pharmacy Practice and Public Health. As the 20th United States Surgeon General and a prior member of the President's Coronavirus Task Force, Dr. Adams has been at the forefront of America's most pressing health challenges. A regular communicator via TV, radio, and in print, Dr. Adams is an expert not just in the science, but also in communicating the science to the lay public and making it relevant to various audiences. Dr. Adams is a licensed anesthesiologist with a master's degree in public health and ran the Indiana State Department of Health prior to becoming the Surgeon General. In the State Health Commissioner role, he managed a $350 million budget and over 1,000 employees, and led Indiana's responses to Ebola, Zika, and HIV crises. Notably, Dr. Adams helped convince the governor and state legislature to legalize syringe service programs in that state, and to prioritize $13 million in funding to combat infant mortality. As Surgeon General, Dr. Adams was the operational head of the 6,000-person Public Health Service Commission Corps and oversaw responses to 3 back-to-back Category 5 hurricanes and to a once-in-a-century pandemic. In addition to his recent COVID-19 work, Dr. Adams has partnered with and assisted organizations as they navigate the opioid epidemic, maternal health, rising rates of chronic disease, the impacts of rising suicide rates in our nation, and how businesses can become better stewards and stakeholders in promoting community health. Without further ado, my conversation with Dr. Jerome Adams. Well, welcome everyone to Recovery Stories Have Power. Today I am joined by Dr. Jerome Adams. Dr. Adams, would you like to introduce yourself to our audience?
Well, absolutely. It's great to be here with you today. I'm really pleased to get to speak to your audience. My name is Dr. Jerome Adams. I am a father of 3. I am a physician, and I'm a public health advocate. That's my Twitter handle, Dr. Dad Public Health Advocate. But most people in your audience will know me as the 20th United States Surgeon General. I was the guy on TV during a lot of the pandemic standing next to Tony Fauci. Before that, I was the Indiana State Health Commissioner, where I had to oversee the response to the largest HIV outbreak related to injection drug use in the history of the United States. And I'd say, finally, I am the brother of someone who has substance use disorders. So I have lived experience as a family member dealing with substance use disorder. And I think we often forget about the families, the friends, the community who are in many cases suffering, in many cases having to deal with the problem just as the individual who's misusing substances is dealing with it.
Sure. So let's take it all the way back to the beginning. How did your that lived experience you were talking about kind of guide you into this career path? Was that the absolute driving force? Was there a white light moment, some sort of experiential thing that you had that kind of told you needed to go into this advocacy field?
Well, that's a great question. And no, there wasn't one particular moment that pushed me in this direction. I'm a spiritual person. I am a Christian, and I say that not to offend anyone who may not be, but just so folks understand where I'm coming from. And I very much believe that God puts people in certain positions for certain reasons and gives you experiences to help lead you to that place. And so, as I mentioned, I have a brother who has been incarcerated, has been in rehab, and is still struggling with substance use disorder. I have an uncle who was put in a nursing home because of alcoholism. And I have another uncle who actually died in prison with substance use disorder. So this is something that's very personal to me. But I also, as a Black man, as someone who grew up in a rural community, as someone who oftentimes relied on government assistance to make ends meet and put food on the table when we were growing up, I understand the access challenges that people have. I understand how stigma can impact your ability to get care and people's willingness to help you out. And so I would say that that entire life experience led me to where I am today, and it's the reason why I take on these roles such as Surgeon General, such as Health Commissioner, because I haven't seen many people who look like me and who have the experiences that I've had in these roles, and I want to be a voice for those folks out there who often don't feel represented.
Absolutely, absolutely. So this drive of equity and equal access, from some of the cursory research I did on you, that seems to be a major driving force in most of your work throughout your career. Um, so I guess, can we talk about some like wins, progress? Because it does seem like at least this conversation in the last decade or two has really entered the public zeitgeist and moved us forward in some of those important ways. So I'm just curious, what are some of the keystones that you've experienced throughout your time in this field?
That's a great question. This is something that I have dealt with my entire life. It's something that many people have spent their entire careers focusing on, the idea of of inequality and inequity, and the idea of addressing disparities. But as you mentioned, we've gotten a lot more attention lately, and that is quite frankly because we've had some very public tragedies that have forced the public to reckon with these these situations. And so one of them is George Floyd. And George Floyd really caused us to reflect on how differently some people in our society are treated, and the systemic issues that actually lead to individuals being in very unfortunate situations. And I would say, we talk about George Floyd, but those police officers also. I mean, they have families, and it's unfortunate that they were not given the training and the oversight to be able to appropriately handle a admittedly difficult situation. And I know we're talking faces and voices of recovery here, but I think it's important that we don't lose sight of the fact that many people who do have a substance use disorder have had law enforcement encounters, and in many cases are fearful of coming forward and asking for help when they need it because of that law enforcement stigma that exists. Another situation that happened that's in everyone's consciousness is the pandemic, and the pandemic really shined a light on the fact that certain groups are disproportionately at risk. So what's interesting is the same people who are at higher risk for overdosing or for misusing substances are the people who are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. Marginalized communities, people who live below the poverty level, people with adverse childhood experiences, Black and Brown communities, particularly Native Americans and Blacks. And so those tragedies really forced us to reckon with these issues, and we've seen, therefore, a lot of progress, at least in terms of our willingness to talk about things in the last several years because of those tragic issues that occurred back in 2020. If we're going to be honest, though, we've also seen a pushback. And so there's good and there's bad. There's a yin and a yang to everything. And right now, I think it's important that we resist the efforts out there to weaponize words like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that we help people understand that it's not just about race, it's not just about which bathroom you want to use, but it's about rural inequalities. It is about veterans. We know veterans have a higher risk of misusing substances. It's about any array of individuals who, for whatever reason in their lives, have had a adverse experience, or who live in places or in circumstances where they don't have the resources to be able to make choices that will ultimately result in better health.
Absolutely, absolutely, and these are pretty far-reaching conflicts, I would say. Just frankly, we're in a very divisive time to be an American. But with that in mind, I'm curious what you would say to perhaps some of our recovery advocates listening, how they can use their boots on the ground to talk to people and advocate for some of these shared goals. What would be the advice that you would give to those folks?
Well, number one, um, let's break that down a little bit. I've mentioned the word stigma, but I often have said that I feel stigma kills more people than fentanyl. And I say that because stigma keeps people from even acknowledging themselves that they need help. Because, hey, it just must be because I need to pull myself up by my bootstraps. I just need to be tough. No, addiction is a disease like diabetes. And, you wouldn't tell someone who needs insulin, hey, just tough it up.
Right.
Just tough it out. Stigma also keeps people from being willing to ask for help. I was talking about this the other day. It's crazy to me that back in 2018, when I put out my naloxone advisory, that we still had law enforcement officers, paramedics, firefighters who were unwilling to carry naloxone, who basically had the belief that if you overdosed, then that was on you. And so, like I said, stigma keeps individuals from admitting they need help, but it also keeps other people from being willing to offer help. So, how do we overcome stigma to the point of your question? What can folks on the ground do? Well, stigma is when we separate people into us and them. And us, we're the good guys, and them, they're the bad guys. That's stigma at its root.
Sure.
The way you break down stigma is to show there is no us or them. It's by sharing stories. And it's why, with his permission, I share my brother's story so that folks know that, hey, this can happen even to the Surgeon General of the United States, to his family. And when you do that, it normalizes addiction as a disease and as something that impacts everyone. I can't tell you how many times I've shared my family's story publicly, and folks have come up to me afterwards and said, "Oh, that's happening to my family also. Thank you so much for sharing." So I think that's important. I think another thing that I always try to remind people of is that it's easy to talk about the terrible statistics, because unfortunately there's a lot of them. A person dying of an overdose every 9 or 10 minutes. Story after story of the heartbreaking story of the mother who found her child dead in their bedroom of an overdose. I think it's important we don't forget about those tragic stories and those tragic numbers, but I think it's equally important that we share stories of recovery, that we help people understand it's not just all doom and gloom, but that recovery is possible if we give people the tools and the resources that we know help lead to recovery. And the more we can share those positive stories, the more we can help overcome stigma. So that's what I would say to folks on the ground is for every um, uh, unfortunate story that you recognize, and again, it's important that we recognize and don't forget about the people we've lost. Try to also share a story of someone who's been successful so that there isn't that steady drumbeat of doom and gloom, and people don't just give up and say, well, there's no hope.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as someone personally who lives in like the podcast internet world, that drive of negative engagement and doom scrolling
Mhm.
is just, it is such a powerful pull. I think it's a really prudent reminder for folks to, there is positivity happening. It does exist.
There are some amazing stories out there of people who have been in treatment, literally 9, 10 times, but then finally were able to come out on the other side and are now peer recovery support advocates. Now have gotten back together with their kids and with their family. And I think again, it's important that we share those stories too.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, so back to the naloxone point you had made earlier about first responders. I was watching a press conference that you were doing with, I'm not exactly sure, members of the press somewhere who were substance use disorder advocates and very much in support of harm reduction efforts. And you asked the whole room to raise your hand if you carried naloxone on them, and two people raised their hand. And it seems as though we've come quite a ways from that. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I would say, uh, I don't want to toot my own horn. I hope this doesn't come across this way, but
Toot away.
I am one of the things I'm most proud of in my professional career is the naloxone advisory that I put out as Surgeon General of the United States in 2018. After that advisory, we saw naloxone dispensing go up 400%. And I think more than that, we helped normalize the idea of naloxone. And at this point, at least most people have heard the term Narcan and are familiar with what it's for. So we've definitely made a lot of progress, and that progress is actually reflected in the stats. Many of your listeners may have heard recently, just within the last month, CDC and NIDA have reported that overdose rates now are actually coming down after years and years of increasing. And so I think that's directly correlated to the increased availability of naloxone and knowledge about naloxone and decreased stigma around that form of harm reduction. That said, we've still got a long ways to go. There's still far too many people dying, and the epidemic continues to evolve. We know that college students now are at higher risk than ever because of fentanyl and counterfeit pills. And so, one of the efforts that I'm engaged in is trying to increase naloxone availability on college campuses and at concerts because you're having many more what I would say people think of as accidental overdoses, and no overdose is on purpose, but you can kind of anticipate an overdose in a situation where someone is knowingly injecting with an illegal substance. But in many cases, you've got college students, high school students who are taking pills that they think are Ritalin, or that they think are Vicodin, or that they think are Valium, and they're counterfeit pills with fentanyl in them. So we need to continue to evolve our thinking as the epidemic and the dealers evolve, so that we can continue to save lives.
Absolutely, and I think it's such a crucial thing. You mentioned college campuses, but those numbers went down wholesale. But I do think if we analyze certain communities, they're still being hit in a pretty severe way. It
Well, thank you for saying that, because number one, better is not the same thing as
Right.
good. We're moving in the right direction, and we want to acknowledge that, because we want to acknowledge that there are interventions that are working. But we came from an absolutely horrific place to what is now still a really, really, really bad place. And we said that we don't want to declare mission accomplished in any way, shape, or form. Still far too many people dying overall. But I want to highlight a point that you made. We know that certain groups, again, Black and brown communities, LGBTQ plus, still disproportionately um, dying at high overdose rates, and so we need to make sure we're focusing in on those communities in terms of our outreach and our interventions.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's yeah. I think, and it all comes back to that stigma word that you were talking about, stigma, and then health inequity that we kind of kicked this whole conversation off with. Um, so how can we communicate that these harm reduction programs, whether it's naloxone, I guess we haven't talked about others like needle exchanges or medication assisted treatment. Um, how can we communicate that these are functional to folks who might have some of that stigma ingrained?
Well, a couple of things we need to do, and I don't want to repeat myself, but I do think it's important that we share success
Sure.
stories. If we can share a success story of someone who was resuscitated with naloxone and then was able to get into evidence-based treatment, assisted by a peer recovery support specialist who themselves is someone who's in recovery, and then was able to get medication-assisted treatment to help them be successful in recovery and treatment and recovery. Then we normalize this as something that actually works in community. So I think we need to share those positive stories. Number one. Number two, we quite frankly need to continue to do more research. And I'm at Purdue University right now. We do a lot of research in STEM and computer science and in engineering. We need more research really illustrating that these different interventions work, so that when we go to policymakers, we can say, "Hey, we need to do this because the evidence shows that it saves lives, that it actually that it actually saves money for insurers and for the state in the long run." I think those are important ways that we can actually put a face on the issue, but also put some data behind it, so that we can make the case that, hey, this isn't enabling drug use. This is actually enabling recovery.
Sure, sure. If I might ask, what is some of the research that you've been doing in those terms lately?
Well, so at Purdue, I'm in a more strategic position,
Sure.
and so I don't do the research myself. But what I do is try to help professors at Purdue and folks who are working at Purdue do the research that will allow us to move forward in this space. So I'll give you a concrete example. At Purdue, again, we're an engineering school. Neil Armstrong, first man to walk on the moon, went to Purdue. So we try to figure out how we can lend our unique expertise to this problem. And one of the things that they've been working on at Purdue University are naloxone drones, so that when someone overdoses, you don't have to wait for an ambulance to show up. We can send you naloxone to your house by a drone that can hopefully get there in time to actually save a life. Another place we're leaning into is data collection and dashboards. Again, I mentioned computer science. How can we use AI to detect trends earlier on in terms of where a particularly dangerous batch of fentanyl may be, or where we might want to extend resources like syringe service programs and and medication assisted treatment. So better use of data, better use of technology. Those are areas we're leaning into at Purdue.
That's very exciting. It's so good to hear about again, success stories, or at least people working hard in the direction that's going to save people.
Exactly. People
Yeah.
innovating in the space. Again, the epidemic continues to evolve, and so we have to make sure we're innovating right along with it so we can keep up with the epidemic. And if we do that, then and eventually get to a place where we're running faster than our opponents, if you will, then we'll actually eventually win this race.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, I think it's stories and communications. That's kind of why we're here on a podcast. Um, so, short time ago, you did mention some of the misconceptions surrounding the introduction to naloxone or other harm reduction means, just from like maybe first responders who were just like, no, I'm not going to do that. Um, do you have any general kind of concepts of like what are some of the stigma that people have around this stuff, and how we can communicate to them that like, hey, this is scientifically backed?
Well, again, number one, we can't say it's scientifically backed if we don't have the
Sure.
science. So we need to work with academic partners to actually collect data. And I say that because there are a lot of really amazing and hardworking community advocates who could care less about the data. They're out there trying to help individuals, and they don't have the time or the desire, or the expertise to be able to evaluate their programs. But what I would say is it's incredibly important that you do it if you want to be able to sustain those programs, if you want sustainable funding for those programs. So I think that that's critical. I think that one of the challenges, to be fair, is that law enforcement, and paramedics, first responders, they see the bad.
Yeah.
I mean, they're the ones that are called when you call 911, and they see the same people over and over and over again overdosing, and they don't see the good. And that is why that's how stigma builds. And so, like I said, we need to make sure we're also sharing with them the success stories, so that they understand that, hey, um, you saw this person over and over and over again, but guess what? They finally got connected with treatment and they were able to be successful. Same thing with policymakers. We've got workforce issues in many communities, and I've heard some great stories. Belden is a wire plant in Indiana that actually pays for people to go into treatment. But if they're successful in treatment, they save a job for them. And they found that those are amongst their most loyal employees. Grayston Bakery in Yonkers, New York, hires people with a history of substance use disorder or who've been previously incarcerated, and they train them and they provide a social worker on site to help them deal with their issues. But they found that those folks, who are in their program, are amongst their most loyal and hardest working employees. So helping people understand that, hey, doing this is not just good for the individual, it's good for society and it's good for the workplace, I think is important.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I believe you mentioned it earlier. It saves money. It's prevention is cost effective.
Exactly. As Ben Franklin said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so, but we have to illustrate that when we want people to make that upfront investment, and that's the challenge.
Sure, sure, absolutely, absolutely, and I think uh, just kudos for you and the good folks at Purdue, and I've talked to so many folks in high level education that are helping build these data driven, science backed guides for just how we can help better combat this crisis, right?
Exactly, exactly. And also, I mentioned my work in government. I think once we have the data, then we have to use the data in a way that drives
Mm.
change. And what do I mean by that? If we know there's evidence-based practices that result in better outcomes, then insurers and payers need to leverage that criteria and say, hey, we're not going to pay if you're doing something that has not been that's been shown not to be successful. But conversely, we will pay you more, or we'll find innovative ways to pay you if you're doing things that are successful. So I'll give you a concrete example of this. There's a treatment center, um, who I've spoken to and worked with, called Crossroads Treatment Center. And they're largely based on the East Coast, Tennessee, um, uh, I believe South Carolina. They're in Philadelphia, but they actually address what we call the social determinants of health. Um, they address things like housing and transportation and food insecurity, because they know that when they address those things, you can build trust with an individual, and you can actually put them in a better place to be successful in recovery. Here's the problem: is payers traditionally don't pay for those things that we know to be successful in terms of helping people in recovery. And so Crossroads is helping develop innovative payment models where you get a per member per month type of payment from an insurer, as opposed to what traditional fee for service, how that operates. And I'm getting a little wonky here, but um, traditional recovery is we pay you for certain services for a very for a finite amount of time, and when if you don't meet that criteria for the service, or the time runs out, too bad. We really want to help people rethink the way we're paying for treatment and recovery, so that it's actually evidence-based and provides people the holistic care that they need.
Absolutely. That makes, as someone in recovery myself, I know that I haven't stopped being in recovery in these last 10 years. you know, I think there's something to be said about, from a policy and insurance perspective, like both sides of that coin. I think following these new trends, because it seems like there is some growing power behind just general knowledge of what this epidemic looks like.
Yes,
Um,
completely agree.
yeah. So what maybe are some, like, you've talked a little bit about what maybe insurance should look like. What are some policy goalposts that you would love to see?
Well, again, I would love to see naloxone available on more college campuses, and greater availability of overdose reversal agents like naloxone. We often talk about Narcan or naloxone, because that had been the only game in town. But there's a new agent out called Opv, or nasal nalmefene, that is more potent, and again an innovation that actually is more aligned with the fentanyl that we're seeing out there nowadays. So, and again, we have lots of data that shows us that when you saturate communities with opioid overdose reversal agents, you will lower your overdose rates. Now, it's important to remember that that is just a band-aid. It's an important band-aid to stop the bleeding, but then you need to get folks into recovery. So we need to think about what that looks like: more outpatient recovery, more innovative recovery models, because we're never going to have enough beds to send everyone into inpatient recovery. We need peer recovery coaches. We need to support that as a policy, so that when folks are waiting to get into recovery, they have someone who can stand by them and support them with lived experience. And then, as we mentioned earlier, we need medication assisted treatment. That's a policy intervention that we know is a best practice, but that uh, not enough people get, even when they're in recovery. So we need to make it easier for folks to get methadone and buprenorphine, so that they can actually be successful in recovery. And we need more outreach on the front end. So syringe service programs are an important way to reach out to folks who are currently misusing substances, and to give them an opportunity to actually form a relationship with someone, who can potentially get them into treatment and recovery.
Absolutely, absolutely. And hearing all of the steps laid out like that, really does a lot to do stigma busting, as we were saying. Because I mean, I think the thing that I kind of hear in the sort of echoes of the popular culture is like, oh well, a syringe exchange program, that's just facilitating use, or medication assisted treatment is just another medication or whatever. But but when you talk about specific timelines to get someone from active substance use or misuse into a life, right? Like a life that they want to be living their best existence. I think that's a powerful narrative.
It is, and unfortunately, many people, as we discussed earlier, only see one part of that journey. They see the overdose, and the treatment with naloxone, or they may see the syringe service program, and the person injecting, or they may see the incarceration. We need to help them see the full journey from proactive outreach to these communities all the way through to what successful recovery looks like.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, as we're starting to approach time, uh, I have just a couple more questions for you. Uh, One, so you've been in this space for some time now, and you've really headed up some pretty politically charged moments in American history, in recent American history. Um, uh, One, kudos, good job, because that's so hard. But two, how how can what advice would you have to like people working in the public health field for uh telling communicating in ways that help build and maintain trust, because I know that there is a lot of divisiveness, misinformation, echo chambers that are consistently churning out these anti public health sentiment. Um, how did you combat that? What advice might you have for those folks?
Well, what I would say, number one, is that you have to know your audience. If your audience is law enforcement, then they're worried about public safety. If your audience is legislators, they're often worried about um, fiscal um, the fiscal concerns in their state. And I say that because we often think that the story of the person overdosing is enough. And I think it's incredibly important to tell those stories, but I think it is equally important to create the link between that individual story and what is actually motivating the person who you're talking to at a particular point in time. So we see someone a tragic overdose. The sheriff may see someone who committed multiple property crimes over and over and over again. And so one of the things that I found that's effective in speaking to sheriffs is to show to show the data that links syringe service programs with actually a lowering in property crime rates. And a lowering in needle stick injuries to law enforcement officers. So you gotta put yourself in your audience's shoes and really try to understand them, which leads to the broader point that I'm going to make here. And that is it's one of my favorite sayings. People need to know that you care before they care what you know.
Mm,
And so you have to show the person you're speaking to that you care about their priorities, that you care about their concerns, and really genuinely try to address their concerns and try to find a win-win. Getting wonky, we often talk about this concept of a Venn diagram. And your Venn diagram may be here, their Venn diagram may be there, and you've got to work to try to figure out where those two circles come together and overlap and work in that overlap space. And if you can do that, you can be effective. But if you think you're going to convince people to leave their circle and come over to your circle, more often than not, you're not going to be successful. But if you show you're willing to go over and spend some time in their circle and then figure out where your circles overlap, you have much more success.
absolutely, absolutely. That makes so much sense. Leading with empathy? What? It's
It's easy to say, it's hard to
it
do.
true. True. Yeah. Again, it just the polarization, the division. It's loud and it's aggressive, and I think that is such a good place emotionally, spiritually to start from. Just where are we instead of where am I, where are you?
Exactly.
That's wonderful. So as we wrap up, there's one question that we always end our shows with, and that is, what's one piece of advice you have for our audience, a creed, a motto, a philosophical framework that has helped you in your life?
Well, I already hit you with it, but it's worth restating. People need to know that you care before they care what you know, and that's whether you're talking to a police officer, that's whether you're talking to a legislator, that's whether you're talking to someone who you're trying to bring into treatment and recovery. If they don't feel like you care about them, then all the education in the world isn't going to make one bit of difference. And so always try to to understand their perspective and their priorities, and try to genuinely show them that you care about them, and that you're willing to help them address their immediate priorities, and then they're going to be much more receptive to respond to you.
Fantastic. Dr. Adams, thank you so much for joining us on the pod. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
No, this has been fantastic. It's been fantastic. Thank you for the work that you and Faces and Voices of Recovery do in this space. And I hope folks will try to reflect on those positive stories out there. We are making progress. There is hope. And I remain hopeful for the future because so many great people out there are having success and doing great work. So thanks, Oliver. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Recovery Stories Have Power. And thank you so much to Dr. Adams for joining us on the pod. We've got a couple more episodes for you this year, and then we'll hit the ground running next year with some very exciting guests. This podcast is produced and engineered by me, Oliver Books, and co-produced by our wonderful staff here at Faces and Voices of Recovery. Special thanks to Chris Tate for use of this song, Come On Home by Belle Ghoul, and shout out to the good folks at his RCO, Passenger Recovery in Hamtramck, Michigan. Be sure to give us a like and subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so that you can stay up to date with all the goings-on in the advocacy world of recovery. If you have comments, questions, or suggestions, shoot us an email. That's podcast@facesandvoicesofrecovery.org. And until next time, thanks for listening.